All of you continue with your meal. I'm going to go ahead and get started and try to talk over the clanging of the dishes and so forth. I'm John Denson, Vice Chairman of the Mises Institute, and today we are looking at the reassessment of the presidency because we live in the age of the imperial presidency. Almost all of the founding fathers, with the notable exception of Alexander Hamilton, designed the Constitution to prevent this very thing from happening. Looking back on more than 8 centuries of English history, the framers of the Constitution saw that it was primarily during wartime that the government began to increase in power, and it was primarily in the executive branch that this increase occurred, and it was almost exclusively in the executive branch which caused those wars. So the American founders removed all war-making powers from the executive branch completely and placed that entirely with the legislative branch in order to try to cure that problem. The imperial presidency in America, however, has evolved primarily because numerous presidents have ignored the Constitution and usurped the congressional war-making powers. Today I want to talk to you about 2 of our most imperial presidents, but as we saw in our survey today, they are considered by the general public to be probably our 2 greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Lincoln and Roosevelt both acquired their mythical greatness primarily because they were presidents during 2 of America's greatest crises, the War for Southern Independence, and I say that because Joey Rothbard won't let me say the Civil War, and World War II. The general public still perceives that these 2 wars were forced upon these presidents, and their greatness arises out of the fact that they were able to accept these challenges and to guide the nation successfully to victory. My argument today will be that both Lincoln and Roosevelt perceived that they needed a war for their own political purposes and provoked their respective enemies into firing the first shot in order to create the public impression that their respective wars were defensive and therefore just. First, let's look at why Lincoln needed a war, and then secondly, how he got the South to fire the first shot. A Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and I'm sure he must have gotten his Pulitzer Prize before he wrote this essay, has written a very interesting essay where he compares Lincoln with Bismarck. They were both contemporaries, and they were both men of blood and iron who were saddled with a confederation of states and lacked a strong centralized government. Both men wanted to abolish these confederation of states and create a nation with a strong centralized government. Douglas says that Bismarck had to provoke 2 wars in order to accomplish his purpose, but Lincoln only had to provoke 1. The Congress of Vienna had settled the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and 1816 by joining Austria with the Confederation of German States. Bismarck wanted one German nation, and he wanted Prussia to be in control, and he could not do that with Austria being there. So he provoked a war between Prussia and Austria, which is now called the 7 Weeks' War, which Prussia won. Bismarck was thus able to bring in the North German states, who were all Protestant states, to join with Protestant Prussia. Then at that point, he next provoked the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Bismarck boasts in his diary that he intentionally changed the wording of the Prussian king's reply to the French government concerning their controversy. And this so infuriated the French government that they declared war. In order to defend against the French aggression, Bismarck was able to bring in the remaining Catholic states in Germany and thus create a nation instead of a confederacy. And he created a strong national government in Prussia over which he now had control. Bismarck's famous fraudulent reply to the French is now known in history as the Ems Dispatch, E-M-S, Ems Dispatch. Lincoln likewise was faced with a confederation of states with significant rights and no strong national government. Both he and his new political party preferred a nation with a strong national government which would protect northern manufacturers from European competition by instituting high protective tariffs. All of this Tom DeLorenzo has gone over. But the tariff would force the agricultural South to pay an excessive price for manufactured goods, whether they were European or northern. One purpose of having the strong national government was to create a partnership between certain businesses in order to enhance those business interests. Northern political power ensured that most of the tariff revenues, however, went to northern states for internal improvements, such as canals, railroads, and this primarily helped northern businesses. That since the South paid 75% of all the tariff, and the tariff was almost the sole source of revenue for the federal government, the South was paying this, and so the North was making the South pay the tax. But they were either able to keep those taxes in the North, or they were able to keep the excessive profits from their goods in the North. So the whole system was a transfer of Southern wealth to the North. Now, Lincoln had been elected as the first president of a new Republican Party, but he came into office in a very weak political position. He carried only 18 of 36 states. He received no electoral votes in the South. He received less than 40% of the total popular vote. His party controlled neither House of Congress. His party only had one Supreme Court justice. In his inaugural address, Lincoln completely removed slavery as an issue between the North and South. Lincoln pledged not only to try to avoid trying to abolish slavery in the states, but he actually endorsed the action of both houses of Congress, which had passed the proposed 13th Amendment. Not many people know that the first 13th Amendment was to constitutionalize slavery in the South, and Lincoln endorsed that. Of course, that amendment was never submitted to the people for a vote. Furthermore, he promised in his inaugural address that he would enforce the fugitive slave law, and made each member of his cabinet pledge in writing to do the same. Therefore, the South was in the best possible position in regard to this issue of slavery than they'd ever been. However, the South considered Lincoln's inaugural address as a declaration of war because he stated that the southern states did not have a right to secede, even though in 1848, in a speech in Congress, Lincoln had endorsed secession and called it the most sacred right, our best protector of individual freedom. Furthermore, he vowed to use force or invasion, if necessary, to collect the taxes and recover the forts that remained in the Southern Territory. The Morrill Tariff was passed on March 2, 1861, 2 days before Lincoln was sworn in. This became the highest protective tariff in history and soon constituted, in 1862, 47% of the value of the imported goods. However, 9 days later, the Confederate government passed its constitution and prohibited a protective tariff, and Congress set a maximum rate of 10% as the rate of tax. This disparity in taxes caused Lincoln supporters in the business community in the North to demand war, and there are many editorials you can read in the Northern press advocating war to protect protect Northern business. And they wanted to force the South back into the Union to prevent the North from losing the foreign trade to the South, and Lincoln was desperate to preserve his source of revenue to run the federal government. A major problem, however, resulted in the fact that there was almost universal sentiment in the nation, even in the North also, that the federal government had no right to use force to bring the seceded states back into the Union. Therefore, Lincoln needed a war desperately, but he needed a war that was started by the South. In order to get the South to fire the first shot, he used the lesson he had learned from President Polk, who had provoked the Mexicans into firing the first shot to start the Mexican-American War in 1846. Polk used his power as commander-in-chief to order American forces into a disputed boundary line, and this caused the Mexicans to fire the first shot. Lincoln became the strong anti-war congressman, accused Polk of starting an unconstitutional war by this provocative act. Lincoln's masterful act in getting the South to fire the first shot was later emulated by many American presidents, including McKinley, Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and LBJ. To see how Lincoln provoked the South into firing the first shot, it's necessary to look at a very short history of the two forts that were involved: Fort Sumter in Charleston and Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. Prior to Lincoln's accession to the presidency, President Buchanan had attempted to reinforce Fort Sumter, and he used a merchant ship, but below deck it had 200 soldiers. It was called the Star of the West. The South learned about the fraud. As the ship approached Fort Sumter, they fired a shot across the bow, and the ship left. Buchanan promised solemnly he would never try to reinforce that fort again. In regard to Fort Pickens, there were several skirmishes which finally resulted in a formal pledge by Buchanan he would not attempt to reinforce Fort Pickens. Therefore, in both cases, there was a formal truce between the federal government and the Confederacy that the North would not attempt to reinforce and the South would not fire on any fort if they abided by that pledge. Now, Lincoln, through the testimony of General Winfield Scott, the head of the Army, sent him to Congress. General Scott testified that Fort Sumter could not be reinforced and that it would soon be evacuated. Claiming executive privilege, however, Lincoln refused the request of Congress to give them any information about the correspondence coming from Major Anderson at Fort Sumter, and also refused to give them anything about the status of the truce that existed in regard to both forts. A retired naval officer by the name of Gustavus Fox had proposed first to the Buchanan administration and then to the Lincoln administration a plan on how to reinforce Fort Sumter by sending several tugs and then some whaling boats with troops and ammunition, and then they would bring in a fleet of ships to have cover for them. Both the Buchanan administration rejected this, and in a cabinet meeting on March 15, 1861, the Lincoln administration rejected the plan also. Following this cabinet meeting on March 15, however, Lincoln sent 3 people into Charleston to visit Charleston and Fort Sumter. One of these was Fox, author of the plan. The other was a close personal friend of Lincoln by the name of Colonel Ward Lamon, Lamon. Lamon was sent as a personal delegate to visit with South Carolina Governor Pickens, and Lamon presented himself as the personal emissary of the president. Told Pickens that he was sent there to inform him that ships would soon be arriving to evacuate the troops at Sumter. He described the ships, exactly how many there would be, and he said he would be coming back with them. In the course of this conversation, however, Colonel Lamon received some critical information which was reported back to Lincoln, which allowed Lincoln to devise his new plan on how to provoke the South into firing the shot. Lamon discovered in his conversation with Governor Pickens that if the North even attempted to bring food to Fort Pickens, then they would fire on the fort. Actually, Major Anderson had plenty of fresh groceries and meats on a daily basis, because with the consent of the Confederate government, he was receiving constant supplies from Charleston merchants and grocers, all with the consent of the Confederate government. He also had supplies furnished by the North that would have lasted him up through April 26. So there was no starving garrison at Fort Sumter. But any stay by Major Anderson after April 26 would be only with the consent of the South, which was furnishing his supplies. Immediately after Colonel Lamon informed Lincoln the South would fire the first shot if food was attempted to be delivered, Lincoln called for another cabinet meeting on March 29, and a new vote was taken, and they adopted the Fox plan. Only 2 members of the cabinet voted against it. On April 1, Lincoln issued the order to Fox to get ready to go by April 6. He would have one ship with just food on it, but there would be all additional ships with troops and well-armed ships that could fire and battle the forts on the Fort Sumter. On April 8, Lincoln sent a delegate from the State Department with a written message to Governor Pickens that he was now sending a ship with food supplies only. But if the South attempted to resist this, then Lincoln would use the remaining ships and their guns and troops to completely reinforce the fort. Now, after Lincoln issued his order on April 1 to get the ships ready, Southern sympathizers in New York began to see a flurry of activity in the preparation of ships being made ready with guns, troops, ammunition. and they perceived that Lincoln was ready to engage in a full-blast assault on Fort Sumter. They reported this to Charleston, and the South then issued an order informing Major Anderson that his supply of food would be cut off on April 7. It's important to keep these dates there, that his food supply was not going to be cut off till April 7, but Lincoln on April 1 had put the plan into effect to, quote, feed the starving garrison. When the South sent its delegates to Fort Sumter to inform Major Anderson that his food supplies would be cut off on April 7, they also asked him to leave no later than April 12, following his orders, but Anderson, following his orders, refused to abandon the fort. The South informed him that they would commence firing on the early morning hours of April 12. Just as the initial ships began to arrive to implement the Fox plan, the South fired the first shot because they knew that Lincoln was going to reinforce the fort in violation of the truce. The fact that Lincoln was bringing food supplies indicated he did not intend to abandon Fort Sumter and showed he was willing to reinforce the fort with troops and weapons. The South bombarded Fort Sumter for 36 hours, but there were absolutely no injuries, no bloodshed, no fatalities. However, the South allowed Major Anderson to have a ceremony to lower the flag and evacuate the fort. And it was during this ceremony that a cannon exploded and killed one of Major Anderson's men, which was the only problem in the whole assault. So when did the war start? Our history books tell us the South started the war on April 12 by firing on Fort Sumter. There was no bloodshed, no problem. The North evacuated peacefully. But without consulting Congress, Lincoln on April 15 unconstitutionally called for the raising of an army of 75,000 militia to invade the South. He unconstitutionally appropriated funds for their use without the approval of Congress. Furthermore, he called for Congress to meet, but not until July 4, 1861, which allowed him 10 weeks to become America's first dictator. During the war, the U.S. Supreme Court was called on to decide in several civil cases the date that the war started. And they held that it was neither the firing on Fort Sumter nor Lincoln's call for troops on April 15. The Supreme Court declared that the war was started by Lincoln in two presidential directives calling for the complete blockade of the South. The first was on April 19, and the second was on April 26, which included the other seceded states which had come in. However, for practical purposes, the North believed Lincoln's story that Fox had been on a peaceful mission to deliver food to the starving garrison, and the South had fired upon the American flag. In northern minds, the South had started the war. Excuse me. There are several smoking guns about Lincoln's purpose, and I'll just have time for one, which reveals clearly Lincoln's plan. This is a diary entry from a close friend and political associate, Senator Browning from Illinois. He had been appointed to the Senate in June of 1861 to fill the vacancy in the Senate created by the death of Stephen Douglas. Browning arrived early for the July 4th session of Congress, went to the White House on the night of July 3 to meet with his old personal friend and listen to Lincoln read the address he intended to give Congress the next day. Lincoln did not know that his close personal friend, Browning, kept a meticulous diary. And he did not know that he thought he was speaking confidentially to someone who would not reveal anything that was said. It was then he put down the speech and told Browning about his plan. Here's what the Browning diary states, quote, "He told me that the first thing placed," this is Browning talking about his conversation with Lincoln, "he told me the first thing that was placed in his hands after the inauguration was a letter from Major Anderson announcing the impossibility of defending or relieving Sumter. He then called the cabinet together and consulted General Scott. That Scott concurred with Anderson, and the cabinet, with the exception of Postmaster General Blair, were for evacuating the fort, and all the troubles and anxieties of his life had not equaled those which intervened between this time and the fall of Sumter." Now listen to this. "He conceived the idea and proposed sending supplies without an attempt to reinforce giving notice of the fact to Governor Pickens of South Carolina. The plan succeeded. They attacked Sumter. It fell, and thus did more service than it otherwise could, end quote. That's about as close as you get to a smoking gun about a devious politician's purposes. The Fox plan was to bring food and troops if necessary, and that plan completely failed. Therefore, Lincoln is not talking about the Fox plan when he says the plan succeeded. Obviously, he's talking about the success of his own plan, which was to cause the South to fire the first shot. Many of Lincoln's defenders, including historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., have defended Lincoln's dictatorship and his unconstitutional actions during the war on the basis that this was a military necessity brought on by defending against the aggression of the South. In answer to this defense of necessity, I would simply remind you of John Milton's phrase in Paradise Lost that, quote, necessity is the tyrant's plea, end quote. Now let's turn to Roosevelt. You will find very few books and little information on the story I've just told you about Lincoln and his first shot. This is partly because there was no congressional investigation or any investigation at all about the Lincoln episode. However, with Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor, there were several investigations, one of which was initiated by Roosevelt himself. The Roberts Commission was the first investigation, and its purpose and its effect was to blame the Pearl Harbor commanders completely for the disaster at Pearl Harbor and to cause all the attention to be directed to them and away from Washington. It caused them to resign in disgrace for the rest of their lives. However, after the war, and of course after Roosevelt's death, a joint committee of Congress began a thorough investigation in 1945, and this was completed in 1946. One author, George Morgenstern, has gone through all of the testimony and all of the exhibits and published in 1947 what is still, I think, the best book on the subject, entitled Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War. The conclusion of the Joint Committee went strictly according to party lines, but the minority report of the Republicans concluded that President Roosevelt and General Marshall were the ones primarily at fault for the debacle at Pearl Harbor. They believed that the administration had information which, if presented to the Pearl Harbor commanders, would have allowed sufficient time to avoid a surprise attack, thereby saving lives and ships. Morgenstern's book also comes to that conclusion. Professor Thomas Bailey is a well-trained historian of diplomatic relations, and he has provided the Plan B defense for the Roosevelt supporters, who have now been overcome with the fact that the evidence is so strong that Roosevelt was guilty. This is also the position, by the way, of William F. Buckley, Jr. Here's what Professor Bailey states, quote, Franklin Roosevelt repeatedly deceived the American people during the period before Pearl Harbor. If he was going to induce the people to move at all, he would have to trick them into acting for their best interest, or what he conceived to be their best interest. He was like the physician who must tell the patient lies for the patient's own good. The country was overwhelmingly non-interventionist to the very day of Pearl Harbor, and any overt attempt to lead the people into war would have resulted in certain failure and almost certain ousting in 1940, with a consequent defeat of his ultimate aims, end quote. The public, however, which has not studied all this evidence, is still influenced by the myth perpetuated by intellectuals and the media that Roosevelt did not provoke the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor, and that he was genuinely surprised by the attack. Therefore, it's our task to continue to study this subject, inform the public about the truth, and destroy this myth so that the public will see the danger of the imperial presidency and how deception can be practiced by those who assume the awesome powers of the imperial presidency. The general public is still largely unaware that Roosevelt was working directly and secretly with Churchill for a year and a half before Pearl Harbor in order to drag America into the war. Churchill's son Randolph has stated in his recollections of his father that before America entered the war, he asked his father, "How are you going to win this war?" And Churchill stated, quote, "I shall drag the United States in," end quote. Churchill had already played a major role in doing the same thing of dragging America into World War I to bail out the British Empire. The most interesting part of this deception involves the working by Roosevelt directly with a secret British spy whose code name was Intrepid. The James Bond novels and movies are all based on some of the activity of Intrepid. The author of those novels, Ian Fleming, was an agent, direct agent of Intrepid. The real activity and purpose of Intrepid, however, and his agents was to bring America into the war through false propaganda, through murder, through slander of Roosevelt's opponents, and many other methods. There's an excellent new book just released on the subject by the title of Desperate Deception: British Covert Operations in the United States, 1939 to 1944. It's written by Thomas E. Mahl, M-A-H-L. The book shows how Intrepid and his men helped rig the 1940 Republican nomination for Wendell Willkie to remove foreign policy as an issue in that race, and how they provided two mistresses to Senator Vandenberg of Michigan, who was a strong anti-war senator. Then they blackmailed him by threatening to reveal this, and he changed his views. He became a warmongering senator, at the same time just a political whore. An earlier book on this subject is entitled A Man Called Intrepid by William Stevenson. It shows how Intrepid had an American citizen murdered by his name was William Rhodes Davis. He was an Oklahoma oil man. And Davis had established a major source of supply for oil for the German government. Davis, as an American citizen, was killed on American soil when America was not at war with Germany. The FBI came in, made the investigation, prevented any local investigation, and declared that he had died of a heart attack. Now let's look at how Roosevelt provoked Japan into the first shot. The one member of Churchill's war cabinet was Captain Oliver Lightington, who was the British production minister, who knew all about Churchill and Roosevelt's moves to provoke Japan. He stated publicly in a speech in June 20, 1944 in London, quote, "America provoked Japan to such an extent that the Japanese were forced to attack Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty on history, even to say that America was forced into the war." Second, there's another famous diary entry. This is by Roosevelt's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. The entry is dated November 25, 1941, 13 days before Pearl Harbor, and describes a cabinet meeting at the White House where they were discussing the problems with Japan, and the diary states, quote, "There the President brought up entirely the relations with the Japanese. He brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked, probably as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. And the question was, what should we do? The question was, how should we maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves," end quote. Thirdly, Roosevelt tried to provoke the Germans to fire the first shot by sending destroyers into the Atlantic to accompany British ships. They would spot German submarines so that British air could attack and sink. But the plan didn't work. So he sent 3 ships out from the Philippines with Filipino crews and American officers to provoke the Japanese, and they wouldn't take the bait either. So then Roosevelt applied the screws to Japan completely by working with the Dutch and the British to cut off all oil supplies to Japan. By the time of Pearl Harbor, Japan was almost completely cut off with oil, which meant they needed to either surrender or go to war. Roosevelt further froze all Japanese assets in America. Fifth, the Japanese tried desperately to negotiate a settlement with Roosevelt and offered for the Prime Minister, who was part of the royal family, to come to America and talk with Roosevelt immediately after his return from talking with Churchill in August of 1941. Roosevelt absolutely refused to meet with the Japanese Prime Minister. Sixth, Secretary of State Cordell Hull did meet with Japanese diplomats, but issued an ultimatum to them which both Roosevelt and Hull knew they could not be accepted by the Japanese. The real tyranny of the imperial President Roosevelt, however, is shown by the fact that his top military advisor, General Marshall, he and his top military advisor, General Marshall, were repeatedly given information which indicated that the Japanese were going to attack on or about December 7 at either Pearl Harbor or the Philippines. Of course, they attacked on that date, and they attacked both places. The tyranny is proved by the fact that this information was intentionally withheld from the commanders at Pearl Harbor. The reason being that if they had been given the information and knew that an attack was coming, they would have moved the ships out of the harbor, they would have put airplanes in the air, they would have been ready with machine guns, and more than likely the Japanese would have then called off the attack. We now learn from Japanese documents that that is exactly what would have happened. They were only going to attack if surprise was achieved. And if you've seen the movie Tora, 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 those words were meant, we have achieved surprise, proceed with the attack. Let's look at the information that Roosevelt and Marshall knew but withheld from Admiral Kimmel and General Short at Pearl Harbor. This is all key information they did not let these commanders know. First, FDR had received a confidential communication from his ambassador in Japan, Joseph Grew, on January 27, 1941. Grew had learned through a colleague from Peru absolutely reliable information that the Japanese military plan was to launch a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor if they were forced into a war by FDR. Second, what is known as the bomb plot message resulted from intercepted communications of Japanese spies in Hawaii who had devised a grid plan so that they could communicate the location of ships, whether they were coming or going or fitting into different parts of this grid. And they would make a daily radio broadcast of the movement of the ships. The frequency of this information increased drastically the week before Pearl Harbor. Can you imagine that information not being communicated to the Pearl Harbor commanders? Third, the British had a far better code-breaking system than America, and they were actually listening to the military commands of the Japanese at this time. A fairly recent book entitled Betrayal at Pearl Harbor is written by the actual British codebreaker, Eric Nave, N-A-V-E, and a writer by the name of James Rusbridger. Nave states in this book that the British intercepted the actual military communication made on or about November 25 and 26, that the Japanese were at that point sending a massive force of ships, including aircraft carriers and planes, to Pearl Harbor. Nave himself communicated this information directly, translated in English, to Churchill on that date. And there's a dispute between Nave and Rusbridger on whether Churchill communicated that to FDR. But we now have a book by William Casey, former CIA director under Reagan, and he was also part of the OSS organization under Bill Donovan during World War II, worked with him from the very beginning. Casey states in his book, called The Secret War Against Hitler, at page 7, quote, "The British had sent word that the Japanese fleet was steaming east toward Hawaii," end quote. End quote. Fourth, as stated, the Americans had broken the diplomatic code and were intercepting all the communications between the Japanese government and its diplomats all over the world, and especially in Washington. On December 3 and 4, the Winds Execute message arrived, and it stated, quote, "War with America, war with Britain, peace with Russia." On December 6, 1941, the American codebreakers received the first part of a 14-part message. The first 13 parts were taken by Naval Commander Lester Schultz directly to FDR. He met with Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins in the White House. Roosevelt read the message and turned to Hopkins and said, quote, "This means war." The message indicated that the 14th part would soon follow. Finally, the 14th part came during the early morning hours of December 7, and it is called the delivery message. This indicated that an attack would probably occur at 1 p.m. Washington time, which was dawn at Pearl Harbor. The big mystery is, why was this not communicated to the Hawaiian commanders? Admiral Stark, who was head of the Navy in Washington, D.C., received this translated message at 8 a.m. in his office, which was 3 a.m. in Pearl Harbor. The officers testified that they delivered this message to him and begged him to call Admiral Kimmel in Pearl Harbor and tell him the attack would occur at dawn. Stark had on his desk what was called a scrambler phone. He could pick up the phone and talk immediately with Admiral Kimmel, and the message would be scrambled in between, but Kimmel would be able to understand it at the other end. So he had direct access within a matter of seconds to Kimmel. The officers testified that Stark picked up the phone, held it in his hand for, said, maybe a minute, and put it back down. Then he got on his regular phone and attempted to reach FDR, and he got to the White House, and they said he can't be disturbed, even in case of war. So then the message did not get communicated. The testimony of General Marshall was, of course, Stark tried to reach Marshall and reach him, and he was told he was out riding his horse. And General Marshall testified under oath at the hearings that he was, in fact, riding his horse that morning and was unavailable to calls from his office, even though he had known about the 13th part message and a 14th part was coming. He was in his office at 11 a.m., and he had a scrambler phone. He could have called Admiral Kimmel. And he slowly read the message, was the testimony. And then he told him this should be communicated to Admiral Kimmel, but on a non-priority basis. And so it was sent by Western Union telegram and delivered to Admiral Kimmel after the attack. We now have a new book entitled Scapegoats, A Defense of Kimmel and Short at Pearl Harbor, written by retired Navy Captain Edward Beach. And by the way, there are several books just coming out now that were written years ago. And a lot of the Navy people want to protect their friends and didn't want to publish these until after the deaths of their friends or their own deaths. So there's several. This is one of the real good ones because he reviews all of the information and all the books that have been written. But he comes to the conclusion that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were grossly mistreated, much like the Dreyfus affair, for political purposes. And this is the first place I've read this. Says that Secretary of Navy Frank Knox made numerous statements to a close friend named Mr. Stallman, and they have some letters in there about this, that there was, in fact, a secret meeting during the night of December 6, which lasted up until 3 a.m. on the morning of December 7. Present at that meeting were FDR, of course Hopkins, Knox himself, Stimson, Admiral Stark, and General Marshall. All reference to that meeting has been stricken from the White House records. Captain Beach and Admiral Richardson is the person in charge of Pearl Harbor before Kimmel, and Roosevelt kicked him out because Richardson said it was a stupid move to send the fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor without air cover. So Roosevelt kicked him out. So Richardson hated Roosevelt ever since that. Richardson knew Stark very well, and he said that Admiral Stark would have made that call on the scrambler phone unless he was under orders from higher command, and that could only be Marshall or Roosevelt, that the information was not to be communicated. They think that if the command came from the White House at this meeting that ended at 3 a.m., that none of this information was to be communicated to Pearl Harbor before the attack for fear that it might prevent the surprise and it might prevent the attack. When I read about this shocking story of deception, subterfuge, and corruption concerning Pearl Harbor, the one thing that sticks in my mind is that 3,000 American servicemen died unnecessarily. These men were depending upon their superiors and the commander-in-chief, the president, to be people of integrity and good character and to abide by their constitutional duties. Instead, Roosevelt sacrificed these men and half the Pacific Fleet in order to get the enemy to fire the first shot so he could have his war and be the, quote, world's savior against tyranny. The story is told that in one of the battleships that sank, a portion of the hull was still above water, and the survivors outside could hear the sounds of men that were trapped inside. And they had some metal objects inside, and they were banging on the hulls of the ship to let people know that they were trapped and begging for help. And the survivors had to stand outside and listen to the sound of these men hitting those metal pieces against the hull until finally they all began to die out and they knew that the men had perished. I think that an appropriate addition to the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. will be to duplicate the sound of those metal objects hitting against the hull of the ships and have this played for about 5 minutes every hour on the hour, so that Americans will learn what it means to have an imperial president, a tyrant who's corrupt and completely ignores the Constitution. In conclusion, I would remind you of the saying that history should be a hanging judge. In light of the truth of that statement, I think it's time to put the noose of truth around the necks of Lincoln and Roosevelt and hang them high. Thank you.